I was dying in an $18 million penthouse on the 42nd floor, and the people who claimed to love me were packing for Europe. The illness had been consuming me for months, an aggressive autoimmune condition that turned my own body against itself, my immune system hunting my organs the way a starving animal hunts prey. The only thing standing between me and organ failure was a private experimental therapy that cost more each month than most people earned in a year. It had to be taken at the exact same hour every single day. Miss one dose and the decline became violent, fever spiking past 104, joints locking, heart rhythm slipping into chaos. The vials sat on the vanity like tiny glass promises, clear liquid, cold, precise. They were the only reason I still woke up each morning. That night the wind off the Hudson was merciless. Even with the heat running, cold crawled into my bones and settled there. I could barely lift my head from the pillow. From the living room came laughter. My mother-in-law Lorraine and my sister-in-law Brooke were deciding which outfits would look best under the Amalfi sun. My husband Grant was in his study finishing the last of the packing. I could hear the soft scrape of expensive luggage zippers, the clink of champagne glasses, the easy cruelty of people who believed the world owed them beauty. I tapped the glass on the nightstand with what little strength I had left. Grant walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit and the cologne I had bought him for our anniversary, the one that smelled of cedar and something darker. He looked at me the way a man looks at something already finished, not with hatred, not even with irritation, just with the mild annoyance of a man whose schedule had been interrupted by an inconvenient object. "Grant, it's time for my medication," I whispered. "Please." Exhaled like I was the greatest inconvenience of his life. "You've asked 5 times already. We've spent a fortune and you're still like this. Stay there, get it yourself later, we're busy." Lorraine appeared in the doorway, face twisted with open disgust. Her Botox had frozen most of her expressions, but the eyes still worked. They were cold. "We are not cancelling a trip we've planned for months just because you're sick again. Order food if you're hungry, take your own pills. Grant has worked hard all year, he deserves this." Added in that soft, poisonous voice she used when she wanted to sound kind. "Don't be dramatic, Elise. We'll only be gone about 10 weeks, you'll manage." They left me alone in the freezing dark. At 11:40 p.m. I heard the suitcase wheels. Grant returned one final time. Instead of handing me the vials that sat on the vanity, he swept every single bottle into the trash with one cold motion. The sound of plastic hitting the bottom of the can cracked something open inside my chest. I tried to sit up. My body refused. "What are you doing?" I gasped. "That's the only thing keeping me alive." Leaned over the bed close enough that I could smell the cologne and whispered, "The doctor said it's terminal anyway. Every extra day is just prolonging the suffering. It would be better for everyone if you went quickly. Don't worry about the company. I'll take care of my mother and Brooke. All of this will be mine soon." He took my phone, my laptop, every credit card. Then he walked to the electrical panel and flipped the main breakers. He shut off the water valve. Before leaving, he changed the smart lock code. The door closed. The deadbolt slid into place. The penthouse went black, silent and freezing. I lay there in the dark, body burning with fever while my hands and feet turned to ice. Without the medication and without water, I had maybe 24 hours. Maybe less. But I refused to die the way they wanted. Under the mattress, in a place Grant had never thought to look, was an old prepaid burner phone I had kept for years out of pure corporate paranoia. It took me almost 40 minutes of sliding and gasping to reach it. The screen lit up with a full battery. I dialed the one number I had not called in almost a decade. My father's voice answered on the 3rd ring, deep and controlled even at that hour. "Dad, it's Elise. I need help." "They're trying to kill me," was a crash on the other end, then my mother's panicked voice. Within minutes, my father was giving orders in the background. "Do not hang up, we are coming right now." I don't know how long I drifted. The next clear memory was the scream of a metal saw cutting through the front door. Flashlights sliced through the darkness. My father, Sterling Voss, the man who built one of the most powerful private equity firms on the East Coast, came through the broken doorway like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. My mother was right behind him, followed by a private medical team in black tactical gear, carrying portable oxygen, IV bags, and thermal blankets that smelled of sterile plastic and hope. They wrapped me in those blankets and rushed me to a private hospital on the Upper East Side. For days I hovered between life and death. The experimental treatment was restarted at triple the previous dosage. Slowly my body began to fight back. While I recovered, my father quietly put the full weight of the family legal machine into motion. The penthouse had been purchased before the marriage with my trust funds. The company, a specialized logistics and supply chain firm I had built from nothing, was 94% mine. Grant was only CEO because I had given him a revocable power of attorney so he could feel important in front of his family. Every document was prepared in silence. From my hospital bed, I watched their European trip through the public accounts they never bothered to make private. Lorraine live-streamed dinners on the Amalfi Coast, laughing with strangers about how life was too short not to enjoy luxury. Brooke posted photos under the Eiffel Tower in a fur coat paid for with my corporate cards, captioning them with quotes about living fully. Grant bought a Rolex in Milan, the same week doctors were still fighting to stabilize my heart rhythm. In 74 days they spent over $260,000 of my money. I did not cry when I saw the numbers. Something colder settled inside me. By day 30 I could walk the private gardens of the clinic. By day 50 my weight had returned and the grey had left my skin. By day 70 the chief of medicine declared me fully recovered. The disease had been forced into complete remission. I asked to be discharged. My father agreed, but only if his most trusted security team came with me. I returned to the penthouse alone except for 4 silent men in black. The apartment had been cleaned and restored. The air smelled of cedar and cinnamon instead of fear. I changed into a deep red silk dress. I put on red lipstick. I sat on the velvet sofa with a cup of tea and waited. At 3:17 p.m. I heard the luggage wheels in the hallway and the loud, happy voices of people who believed they were coming home to a fortune. Grant tried the old code. It failed. He tried again. Failed. I nodded once. The head of security opened the door. The 3 of them stood frozen in the doorway, jet-lagged and still wearing their travel clothes, designer bags in hand. The smugness on Grant's face died in less than a second. Lorraine's Birkin slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. Brooke stumbled backward over a suitcase. I set the teacup down gently. "How was Europe?" I asked in a calm, clear voice. "You're back a little earlier than I expected. Come in, the door is open." No one moved. Lorraine recovered first. The old arrogance flooded back. She stormed inside, pointing a shaking finger. "You're alive. How dare you change the code to my house? And who are these men? You've been running around with strangers while your husband was gone." Grant stepped forward, trying to reclaim control. "Explain yourself right now. This is still my home." I stood, smoothed the silk dress and walked to the console table. I picked up a thick folder and threw it hard against Grant's chest. Credit card statements spilled across the floor. "On the 15th of last month you spent $28,000 on a watch in Italy," I said evenly. "That same day doctors were using a defibrillator on me." Brooke bought 3 handbags in Paris for $15,000 while they were injecting me with compounds that cost $3,000 a dose just to keep my organs working. "Lorraine, you spent $4,000 on one dinner while I was relearning how to walk because my muscles had atrophied." I looked at each of them in turn. "You threw away the only medication keeping me alive. You cut the power and the water. You locked me in this apartment and left the country so you could wait for me to die and take everything." Every second of it was recorded. Brooke started crying first, already trying to separate herself. "I didn't know it was them. I didn't know they were going to do that." Lorraine's voice turned syrupy and desperate. "Sweetheart, we made a terrible mistake. Forgive us, we're still family." Grant's face had gone grey. He tried the soft voice next. "Elise, I don't know what came over me. Please, we can fix this. We're married." I looked at him with nothing left in my eyes. "Family ended the night you threw my medicine in the trash. You had 74 days of luxury on my money. That was the last charity you'll ever receive from me." I turned to the head of security. "Get them out." The 4 men moved with professional speed. Grant, Lorraine and Brooke were dragged into the hallway while they screamed and cursed. Their luggage was thrown out after them. I closed the heavy door, changed the passcode to a 12-digit sequence, and erased every fingerprint that was not mine. The next morning I went to the bank first. Every joint account was frozen. Every secondary credit card was cancelled. Every dollar that had been sustaining their lifestyle disappeared in 15 minutes. Then I went to the company headquarters in Midtown. An emergency board meeting was called. I presented the documents. Grant's power of attorney was revoked. His position as CEO was terminated for cause effective immediately. When he arrived later that morning in a new Italian suit, security blocked him at the turnstiles and handed him a cardboard box with his personal items and a termination letter. His phone started ringing while he was still standing in the lobby. Brooke was crying because every card had been declined at a cafe in Soho. Lorraine was screaming in the background. By that night the 3 of them were in a cheap motel in Queens with less than $80 between them. I did not stop there. A carefully prepared post went out across every major platform. The security footage of Grant throwing the medication away, cutting the power, and shutting off the water, placed side by side with their European vacation photos. and the credit card statements timestamped to the exact days I was fighting for my life in the ICU. The final clip was live footage of them causing a scene in the company lobby that same morning. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, their names and faces were everywhere. Grant could not get a job interview without being recognized and thrown out. Brooke was expelled from her private university. Lorraine was publicly confronted at a market in Queens and driven away under a rain of insults. The criminal case for attempted murder moved quickly. The video evidence was undeniable. Grant was sentenced to 8 years. The civil case stripped him of any claim to the marital assets and ordered $500,000 in restitution. On the day of the final sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into bright winter sunlight. Lorraine and Brooke, looking nothing like the women who had boarded a plane to Europe 74 days earlier, tried to reach me one last time, crying and begging for money so they could leave the city. I looked at them for a long moment. "I accept your apologies," I said quietly. "But there is nothing left between us. The road you're on is the one you chose. Walk it." I got into the waiting car and did not look back. Behind me were 3 people destroyed by their own greed. Ahead of me was a clean sky, the quiet strength of the family that had never abandoned me, and a life that finally belonged only to me. Some debts are paid in money, others are paid in the exact same cold they once tried to leave you in. That was the end of the 74 days. But the story did not end there. The cold they left me in had a longer memory than any of us expected. The first weeks after the sentencing were quieter than I had imagined. Quiet in the way a battlefield is quiet after the last shot is fired, smoke still hanging in the air, the ground still soft with blood that has not yet dried. I returned to the penthouse every evening and sat on the same velvet sofa where I had waited for them. The tea was always the same temperature. The red silk dress hung in the closet like a flag I no longer needed to wave. I did not wear it again. My father came often. He never stayed long. He would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows and look out at the Hudson the way a general looks at a map he has already conquered. Sometimes he would speak, sometimes he would not. When he did, his voice was the same controlled instrument it had always been. "You did not become soft," he said once. "That is the only thing that matters." Mother brought food, real food, not the sterile hospital trays or the take-out cartons of the recovery period. She cooked the way she had when I was a child, long before the trust funds and the private equity firm and the marriage that nearly ended me. Lamb with rosemary, bread still warm from the oven, soup that tasted like winter and safety. She never asked if I was all right. She simply set the plate in front of me and waited until I ate. I ate. The company absorbed Grant's absence the way a healthy body absorbs a cut. Within a month, the board had installed an interim CEO from inside, a quiet, competent woman named Mara who had been running operations for years, while Grant took credit for every successful quarter. Stock stabilized. Clients stayed. The logistics network I had built continued to move containers across oceans and continents without needing the man who once signed the checks with my name still attached. I went back to work on the 79th day, not as the woman who had been left to die. As the woman who had survived. The staff did not speak of the videos. They did not need to. Everyone had seen them. Everyone knew. The silence around me was respectful rather than pitying. I preferred it that way. At night I still dreamed of the dark. Of the sound plastic bottles make when they hit the bottom of a trash can. The exact pitch of Grant's voice when he told me it would be better if I went quickly. I woke up with my heart racing and the taste of copper in my mouth. Then I turned on every light in the penthouse and walked the rooms until the cold left my bones. The public did not forget. The videos had not simply gone viral. They had become a kind of modern folklore. Clips were still circulating months later, stitched into longer compilations with captions that ranged from furious to almost religious. People recognized Grant on the street, even after he was transferred to a medium security facility upstate. Lorraine and Brooke learned quickly that New York has a long memory for certain kinds of cruelty. The cheap motel in Queens became a more permanent address than either of them had planned. Brooke's university expulsion was only the beginning. Every private school, every internship, every social circle she tried to re-enter already knew her name. Lorraine's attempts to reclaim any fragment of her old life were met with the same cold wall. I did not follow their every move. I did not need to. The world did it for me. Sometimes, late at night, I would open the folder of credit card statements again. Not out of anger, out of something closer to documentation. 28,000 for a watch, 15,000 for handbags, 4,000 for one dinner. The numbers no longer made me cold. They simply existed, like exhibits in a case that had already been closed. The civil restitution order was paid in installments from whatever assets Grant still had left. Most of it came from the forced sale of a small apartment in Brooklyn he had kept in his mother's name, an apartment I had never known about. $500,000. It felt almost trivial next to the $260,000 they had spent in 74 days. I donated the entire amount to a research foundation that funded experimental treatments for the same autoimmune condition that had nearly killed me. The foundation sent a letter. I did not open it for 3 weeks. When I finally did, the language was grateful and careful. I filed it away without reply. 6 months after the sentencing, my father invited me to lunch at the private club he had belonged to for 30 years. The same club where he had once introduced Grant to potential investors back when Grant still wore the mask of a devoted husband. We sat in a corner table overlooking Central Park. The trees were green, the city moved below us like something that had never stopped. "There is a position," my father said after the coffee arrived. "Not at the firm, adjacent, a board seat on a logistics consortium that wants to expand into medical supply chains. They asked for you by name." I looked at him. "Because of the videos? Of the company you built. The videos simply made sure no one could pretend they did not know who you were." I accepted the seat, not for revenge, not even for power, because the work still interested me. Because moving things that keep people alive felt cleaner than the alternative. The first meeting was in a conference room on the 50th floor of a building 3 blocks from my own headquarters. The other board members were careful, polite. They did not mention Grant. They did not need to. When the discussion turned to cold chain logistics for temperature-sensitive biologics, I spoke for the first time. My voice was steady. The room listened. Afterward, one of the older members, a woman with silver hair and the posture of someone who had survived her own wars, waited for me by the elevator. "I watched the footage," she said simply. "All of it, including the part they never put online." I did not ask how she had seen the unedited security files. "Some doors open only for certain people. You did not look away," she continued. "Most people do." I nodded once. The elevator arrived. We rode down in silence. That night I walked the length of the High Line alone. The city lights reflected in the Hudson the way they always had. The wind was cold, but it no longer crawled into my bones the same way. I stood at the railing and watched a freighter move slowly toward the harbor. Containers stacked like the future. The same industry I had built my life around. I thought of the 74 days, of the exact hour the medication was supposed to be taken, of the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, of my father's voice on the burner phone, of the red silk dress, of the teacup, of the folder hitting Grant's chest, of the look on Lorraine's face when the Birkin hit the floor. I thought of Brooke's tears, of the motel in Queens, of the 8-year sentence, of the restitution order, of the research foundation letter still sitting in a drawer, and I thought of the quieter things that had come after, the board seat, the company still standing, the parents who had never stopped answering the phone, the nights the dreams still came and the mornings I turned on every light until they faded. Some debts are paid in money, others are paid in the exact same cold they once tried to leave you in. I had paid mine in full. The rest of the debt belonged to the 3 people who had chosen the road they were still walking. I turned away from the river and walked home. The penthouse was warm. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. I made tea. I sat on the velvet sofa. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and alive. I was no longer dying, I was simply here. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, which was its own kind of victory. Ordinary meant no more emergency board meetings called at dawn. Ordinary meant no more security teams waiting outside every door. Ordinary meant the sound of suitcase wheels in the hallway no longer made my pulse spike. I began taking longer walks. First along the High Line, then further, down into the meatpacking district across the park, sometimes all the way to the East River. The body that had once refused to sit up now carried me for miles without protest. The experimental therapy had done more than force the disease into remission. It had rewritten the rules of what my body was allowed to do. I still carried the vials in a small refrigerated case when I travelled, but the daily terror of missing a dose had loosened its grip. One afternoon in early spring, I found myself standing outside the private clinic on the Upper East Side, where I had nearly died. I did not go in. I simply stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows of the floor where the ICU had been. A nurse I did not recognize came out for a cigarette break and glanced at me without recognition. That, too, felt like a kind of freedom. My mother started inviting me to dinner once a week. Not the formal, careful meals of the recovery period, real family dinners. My father would arrive late, still carrying the scent of the office, and sit at the head of the table the way he always had. We did not speak of Grant. We did not speak of the 74 days. We spoke of the company, of the board seat, of a new acquisition my father was considering, of the way the cherry blossoms were early that year. The ordinary topics of people who had survived something and chosen not to let it define every remaining conversation. Sometimes, after dinner, my mother would walk me to the elevator and press a small container of leftover soup into my hands. "For later," she would say. I always took it. The public interest in the case gradually cooled. New scandals rose to replace it. The compilation videos still circulated in certain corners of the internet, but the daily flood of messages and tagged posts slowed to a trickle. I deleted the accounts that had been created in my name by strangers who wanted to turn my survival into a brand. I did not need a brand. I needed the quiet. Grant's first letter arrived in the 9th month. It was written on the thin paper they issue in the facility. The handwriting was still the same elegant script he had used on our wedding invitations. The content was different. He wrote that he had been thinking, that the time had given him clarity, that he understood now what he had done, that he was sorry, not the soft, strategic sorry of the confrontation in the penthouse, but something that claimed to be deeper. He asked if I would consider visiting. He asked if there was any path back to the life we had once planned. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in the same drawer as the Research Foundation letter and the credit card statements. I did not answer. 3 more letters followed over the next year, each one more carefully worded than the last, each one claiming a greater degree of self-awareness. I never replied. The silence was its own answer. Lorraine tried a different approach. She contacted my father's office through a mutual acquaintance from the old social circuit, someone who still believed that enough money and enough shared history could paper over almost anything. The message was simple. She was willing to disappear from the city entirely if a modest sum could be arranged to help her start over somewhere quieter. My father's assistant replied with a single sentence. No. Brooke vanished from public view more completely. The last confirmed sighting anyone cared to report was of her working a retail shift in a suburb 2 hours north of the city. The photo that circulated was grainy, taken by someone who recognized her from the old videos. She looked thinner, tired, ordinary in a way that had nothing to do with the fur coat under the Eiffel Tower. I did not seek confirmation. I did not need it. 2 years after the sentencing, the company completed its largest acquisition to date, a European cold chain network that specialized in the exact temperature-sensitive biologics I had once depended on to stay alive. The irony was not lost on me. I signed the final documents in the same conference room where the emergency board meeting had stripped Grant of his title. Mara, now the permanent CEO, sat across from me and smiled the quiet smile of someone who had watched the entire arc from the beginning. "You built this," she said. "We built this," I corrected. She nodded. The distinction mattered. That night I returned to the penthouse and stood at the windows for a long time. The Hudson was dark, the lights of the city reflected in the water the way they always had. I thought of the night the power had been cut, of the exact temperature the air had dropped to, of the way my hands had turned to ice while my core burned, of the burner phone under the mattress, of the sound of the metal saw cutting through the door. I thought of my father's face when he came through that doorway, of my mother's hands wrapping the thermal blankets around me, of the private medical team moving with the precision of people who understood that minutes mattered. I thought of the red silk dress, of the teacup, of the folder, of the look on 3 faces when the door opened and they realized the house was no longer theirs. And I thought of everything that had come after, the board seats, the acquisitions, the ordinary dinners, the walks that no longer left me exhausted, the letters I never answered, the quiet that had finally arrived and decided to stay. Some debts are paid in money. Others are paid in the exact same cold they once tried to leave you in. I had collected mine in full. The rest of the story belonged to the people still walking the road they had chosen. I turned from the window, made tea, and sat on the velvet sofa. The penthouse was warm, I was alive, and the life that stretched ahead of me was, finally, only mine. The years did not erase the 74 days. They simply taught me how to carry them without letting them define the shape of every room I entered. On the 5th anniversary of the night the power went out, I flew to Italy, not to Amalfi. Not to the places where Lorraine had live-streamed dinners and Brooke had posed under foreign monuments. I went to a small coastal town further south, the kind of place that does not appear in glossy travel accounts. I rented a whitewashed room with a balcony that faced the sea. I woke early. I walked the narrow streets. I ate simple food. I sat for hours watching the water change color. I did not post a single photograph. On the third evening, a woman at the next table recognized me. Not from the old videos, those had faded enough by then, but from a recent industry profile that had appeared in a logistics journal. She was polite. She did not mention Grant. She simply said that the work I was doing with medical supply chains had helped her sister receive treatment that would otherwise have been impossible. I thanked her. We did not speak again. That night on the balcony, I thought about the difference between the Europe they had taken and the Europe I had chosen. Theirs had been a performance of luxury paid for with money that was never theirs. Mine was quieter. It asked nothing of anyone, except the sea and the sky and the slow passage of ordinary days. I returned to New York with a clearer sense of the life I intended to keep building. The company continued to grow. The board seat led to 2 more. I began funding a small research initiative of my own, focused on making experimental autoimmune therapies more accessible to patients who could not afford the private versions that had once kept me alive. The foundation that had received the restitution money partnered with us. The letter I had once filed away unanswered became the beginning of a longer correspondence. My parents aged the way strong people age, slowly, with the same controlled dignity they had always carried. My father eventually stepped back from the daily operations of his firm. My mother continued cooking. The weekly dinners became something I protected with the same care I once protected the medication schedule. Grant's letters stopped after the 3rd year. I never learned whether the silence was his choice or the facilities. I did not inquire. Lorraine and Brooke remained distant figures whose lives no longer intersected with mine in any measurable way. The city had absorbed them the way it absorbs most people who fall from certain heights, without ceremony, without lasting interest. On the 10th anniversary, I stood once more on the High Line and watched the freighters move toward the harbor. The containers still looked like the future. The wind off the Hudson was cold, but it no longer carried the same memory. I thought of the woman who had lain in the dark with a burner phone under the mattress and a body that was failing. I thought of the woman who had waited in a red silk dress with a teacup and a folder of statements. I thought of the woman who had walked out of a courthouse into winter sunlight and refused to look back. They were all still part of me. But they no longer had to be the entire story. Some debts are paid in money, others are paid in the exact same cold they once tried to leave you in. I had paid mine. The rest of the road was mine to walk, and I walked it.